name is Karima Grant. I have been living in Senegal for 13 years. My mother's from Senegal, my father's from the Caribbean, St. Lucia, and I was raised a little bit all over, but mostly in the United States, mostly in New York City. 13 years ago, myself and my husband decided to come back to live in Senegal because the events of 9/11 were really very hard for us. We lived in New York where the fallout was really was tremendous. And I think psychologically, morally, we both felt like we were looking for a change. You know, all my life, I'd just been waiting for that moment to come back to live in Senegal. I lived here as a child, had a very big family, etc. And I think most importantly, I always thought of Senegal in particular as an extremely well-educated place. And when I say educated, I don't mean formal education, you know, schools, but just even in people who perhaps have never had a formal education, whether it's through language or culture, it is so rich that it actually is a very well-educated place. So that was always the idea. So we moved back here 13 years ago. I worked as an educational administrator, running a specialized program. I also worked as a high school English teacher. And I was so floored and excited and happy with the level I found in Senegalese students. The majority of Senegalese students I worked with were at a very elite private school, elite private bilingual school. But very often, through those students, I would meet other students. And I was just amazed at how brilliant. And that's not to say American kids weren't brilliant, but a lot of the issues that American kids were dealing with, kids here in Senegal weren't here, young people in Senegal weren't dealing with. And I was so impressed that there were so many young people that by 15, 16 could speak 3 languages. So whether it was, you know, Wolof, Serer, or Wolof, French English, Wolof, Serer, French English, whatever, but we understand the relationships of language not only to culture, we understand the relationship of language to brain development. So for me, it was just like, this is amazing. You know, here it is. This is the generation that's going to change Africa. So there was so much hope I had, and I think that's the biggest gift I got, is this idea of hope from young people. But I began to notice that there was some kind of disconnect, whether it was a question of confidence, whether it was a question of opportunity, whether it was a question of the quote-unquote adults that were around. I just felt expectations were so low these young people had for even themselves, or they were unrealistic, or they couldn't see themselves on the global platform. And I just, thought about it a lot, tremendously. And so a lot of the work I did outside of the classroom really became about counseling and personal development and there. When I left the school, I went into leadership training, and I was very blessed to work in an African transformative leadership program that worked with Africans across the continent from 24 countries, if I'm not mistaken. And that was just amazing, because once again, here's this gift of Pan-Africanism, not in a theory, but practicality. Here are 24 different kinds of Africans coming together to talk about leadership. And not leadership, somebody else's idea of leadership, but what leadership means for us, our communities, what we're looking for. So I came out and I became a facilitator, and I began to work for NGOs and fancy organizations, leading teams, and hey, let's talk about leadership and how you can be a better person. I'm sorry, I shouldn't say that. There were some very nice organizations out there. If you've seen that, I liked it. But I began to realize that there's a period of time where we can ask people to become change makers easier without having to disrupt so many things that connect them to society. Because sometimes being a change maker means that you have to give up certain comforts. And sometimes asking somebody who's in their mid-40s, who's the head of a family, who has not only their own children, but perhaps their brother or cousin's children to support, to no longer work for a company or, be more moral in their decisions that they're taking, is extremely difficult. It's complex. It's much easier to work with young people, particularly because we know their brains are developing, right? So very early on, I began to switch. I have always been a creative person. When I grew up in the United States, both my parents were immigrants, but my parents separated very early, so I was raised by my mother. And one of the gifts that I received through the way I was raised is really valuing creativity. When I say creativity, I don't mean like this, like painting and drawing, but that ability to be responsive to your environment and to think things through and come up with some other possible solutions. And I got that. I mean, I really grew up in a very great time in the United States. The hip hop movement grew up like maybe one step ahead of me. And that was when African Americans, Latinos, Asian Americans, we were defining ourselves as being creative and powerful. So it was perfect. Here I am now in Africa, surrounded by all these young people. I was also a writer, so I had written 2 books for children, and I was approached one day to do a workshop for children. And I said, sure, I'm going to teach them how to write a book. And you would have thought I had said, give the children a knife and I'm going to teach them how to kill 25 people. Because the negativity, these kids don't read. They were children from a poor neighborhood in Dakar called Fas. They don't read, you don't speak French, they can't do that. And it was right then and there that I realized the thing that was blocking those children were the perceptions that we had of those children. So, if you will, the project of ImagiNation Afrika was born there. Of course, we did the workshop with the children, and as you can expect, the children surpassed everybody's expectations for them. They went above and beyond. But what was also so powerful for me was that in that space that the children created, other children came. The conversation that one set of children created around their work, other children, we were at Dutasek, in Medina, came in and continued that conversation. So right then I was like, so it's not just about creative activities, it's about space. And when I began to look around Senegal, and then as I traveled throughout Africa, where were the spaces for children? There were none. Okay. You go to schools. Those schools are not meant for children. They try to tell me they're meant for learning. But they're not spaces that are built for children. And that's where I think ImagiNation Afrika was born. Our mission is to transform how children perceive of themselves and their ability to contribute to development. Here in Senegal, 0 to 14, 44% of the population is between 0 and 14. I think the next big age is, 55% of the population, right? 14 to 35 or something like that. So for me, everything we should be doing should be serving those two ages. For me, I'm so impressed that Senegal has so much information that they want to give children. I am so depressed that most African countries don't think that children have tremendous stuff in their heads already. Our belief is that children are coming to us with empty heads. That God, whatever God you believe, I don't want to get religious, don't get mad. But whatever God you believe in or however you believe people are put here, we're just empty slates. there's research now that is showing us that as young as 6 months, babies are able to do cause and effect. They're testing it out, which tells us that babies are already born with this scientific curiosity. And what are we doing with it? Nothing. Or I shouldn't say nothing, but we're not doing what we should be doing, what I think is our role to do if we want a different Africa, if we want a different world. So here at ImagiNation Afrika, we create play spaces, we create programs for children, for parents, and for teachers that promote a different way of understanding learning. We connect different actors in the educational ecosystem. And sometimes they're not just schools or teachers or ministry officials. Sometimes they're private sector. Sometimes they're social entrepreneurs. We connect them with information, resources, and to each other. We believe very much like Wati about sharing knowledge. So we call ourselves, in January we opened up this space here, which is a hub for innovation and learning. And what we do here is we really do a lot of connecting. Children with spaces that they use play to connect with what they know and what they don't know. We have maker spaces in the back for children to play with science, hands-on. We have leadership programs that we do for young people here to connect them with their own possibilities to bring change. We connect teachers to educational resources. And earlier this week we had a huge conference where we connected different practical learning strategies to different people in the ecosystem so that we can have an understanding of what to do. So we have 3 programs here. Generation 2025 are our programs for young people really 15 and up. ImagiNation's physical hub is really focused on children, really about 0 to 14, but our primary demographic is really about 0 to 8, sometimes 10 to 12. And our third program, Nomadic Learning, is really taking information out, teacher training, resources out to different, if you will, adults that can't come to this physical site. Because one of the big issues in Africa is everything's centered in capitals, but we have populations all over, so we have to decentralize. We have to go toward people as opposed to expecting people to come toward us. We have. This is our first hub. We've just opened it in January. We would very much like to, whether it's through us or with partners, have hubs not only throughout Senegal but also in other countries in West Africa. Because I do think it's important that there are spaces that are dedicated spaces for children and learning. And in those dedicated spaces for children and learning, we can support parents and teachers, ministry officials, even cultural spaces, to understand what does learning look like and what do children want and what do children need.